Almost what you see in all these cases is almost a willful desire to actually not really care about the distinction between violence and non-violence, right? So what seems to matter most of all is the political position that someone's taking, whether they advocate for that position in a violent or non-violent way doesn't seem to matter that much.
So it's more about suppressing the political activity than the violence.
Right, exactly.
So discuss the development of the modern radicalization theory and the problems that you've seen with that.
So after 9/11, I think for the first couple of years, when people are trying to make sense of this question of terrorism that suddenly kind of, you know, the kind of preeminent question in national security policy, people are using these very simple kind of formulae of, you know, well, these people just hate us, they hate our freedom, you know, there's an evil ideology out there. And this is the kind of neoconservative kind of analysis. But very soon you start to get academics and people who are a little bit more thoughtful in the national security communities who are trying to say, well, let's try and develop a model of how someone goes from being an ordinary member of the public to becoming a terrorist, right? So and actually that's absolutely right. That's exactly what we should be doing, is thinking about what causes terrorism, not just seeing it as this thing that comes out of nowhere, right? So, so you start to get the concept of radicalization introduced as a way to describe that process of like, how is someone made into a terrorist, right? Unfortunately, rather than pursuing that question in an objective, scholarly way, you have a very narrow idea of what might make someone a terrorist. And it comes down to, in all these models, whether it's the academic ones or the law enforcement agency ones, it comes down to the idea that some kind of ideology can kind of grip someone and turn them into becoming violent, right? Now, firstly, there's no, when you look at these studies that try and come up with empirical data to back that up, the studies just don't stand up to, you know, even the most basic level of scholarly rigor. So, you know, if you wanted to say, okay, what is it that causes terrorism? You look at a number of terrorism cases and you notice that, you know, a lot of those terrorist cases, before someone is involved in some kind of criminal activity, they have some kind of ideology, right? So you say, okay, well, the ideology causes the terrorism. Well, that only works if you also have a control group where you find a whole load of people who didn't have the ideology, who did have the ideology, right? And work out whether the ones who weren't terrorists, you know, also had that ideology, right? And if for every person who has the ideology, you know, for every 1,000 people who have the ideology, one becomes a terrorist, the other 999 don't. It's not actually causing the terrorism, it's something else that's doing that, right? So, but you never get a control group in these studies. So, so the empirical evidence is strikingly weak. But one of the kind of consequences of adopting these models is that if you think that ideology is what's, you know, the kind of root cause of terrorism, then you're going to look for expressions of ideology, right, as your indicators that give you this predictive power that law enforcement agencies obviously ought to have in order to intervene at an early stage, right? So you start to look for indicators that are to do with someone's religious and political opinions, right, which are the expressions of the ideology, or things like, you know, changes of their kind of clothing that they wear, growing a beard. These are kind of other ways in which supposedly this ideology is being expressed. And that's why you then end up with a situation where you say, okay, we want to make sure that we have such a intense level of surveillance in the community that we believe has this problem, i.e., you know, Muslims in the United States. We want to have such a high level of surveillance of that population that we can know when someone is displaying these indicators of you know, political and religious opinion, and that's what we've seen happen, right? That's why we have, you know, from the New York Police Department or from the FBI, such high levels of informants being run in these communities and other forms of surveillance.